Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. In this episode, I am joined by Patrick Kenny, who is the president of the Father Willie Doyle Association. Good morning, Patrick. Good afternoon for you. It's really nice to see you today and to have the opportunity to discuss a person who I've come to know a bit about over the past several weeks, and think that his story should be shared, and the work around his canonization also should be highlighted. And the person is named Father Willie Doyle, who was a chaplain during World War I. He was killed during the Battle of Passchendaele, and I'd like to hear all about his story. There are elements that resonate with me in terms of his early childhood experiences and how he felt drawn into service, how he had some level of awareness that he would be a Jesuit martyr, and also how people have connected with his story and with him as a person throughout the decades following his death in the First World War.
Morning, Heather. Yeah, you've covered off a good summary of the entire story there. So great to talk to you. And yeah, where do you want to start?
I'd love to start from the beginning. Who was Willie Doyle as a child? How did he feel drawn into a spiritual vocation? And then what has happened in the decades following his death in 1917?
Okay, great. So Willie Doyle was born in 1873 in Dublin, in a place called Dalkey, which today is where Hollywood celebrities come for their holidays, and some of them even have houses there. And even in Father Willie's time, when he grew up there, it was a very well-to-do or comfortable place to live. But there were a lot of working class people living nearby, because there had been a mine there for many years, a quarry, and there were a lot of old mining families there, and that becomes an important part of his story that we'll touch on in a few moments. In terms of his family background, he was the youngest of 7 children. And I don't know to what extent your viewers will be familiar with the figure of Saint Therese of Lisieux, a very important Catholic saint, who also plays, in a sense, somewhat of an unusual role in the First World War, which we can touch on later on. But he was born pretty much exactly at the same time that she was, within 6 weeks of her. And we see a lot of parallels between a pious middle-class Irish family and this pious middle-class French family, in the sense that both families were well-to-do, both families had servants, both families produced a lot of religious vocations within them. So in the case of St. Therese's family, pretty much all the girls went and had a religious vocation. And Father Willie's family, out of the 7 children, 4 of them had a religious vocation. And that was not very unusual in the Ireland of that time. I mean, many families would have had at least one religious vocation. But obviously it was quite a pious family. His next eldest brother had become a Jesuit, and that played a very important role in Father Willie's vocational discernment later on in his life. He was a normal boy. He loved playing sports. Dalkey is a seaside town, so he loved fishing, he loved sailing, he loved swimming, he loved playing cricket, tennis, rugby, football, all the usual things. Broke windows in the family home with balls and so on. But what marked him out, I think, as a child, as being very different from other children, was a kind of precocious charity or care for the poor. So as I mentioned, the miners who lived in the town, he would bring pocket money, his own pocket money, to buy things for them if they were poor. He would take food from the family home to bring to them. If there were older people who weren't able to clean their houses, he would go and clean them or paint the houses for them. So this is as an 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old child, which is a somewhat unusual thing, really. As I said, the family had servants, and he was known to get up early in the morning and do the work of the servants. So light the fire or clean the dishes from the dinner the night before. So in many ways, a model child who, we'd all love to have children who would get up early and do the work in the morning for us. And so I suppose it was he was always on a track, I suppose, to become a priest. And it was no great surprise at the age of about 17 when he announced to his father that he decided to become a priest, and had decided to become a Jesuit, primarily because of the influence of his older brother, Charlie, who had entered the Jesuit novitiate just before him. Before he had discerned his calling to be a priest, he'd spent the first 11 years at home being homeschooled, and then he went to Radcliffe College in England, which is a boarding school, which also his brothers went to as well. He spent about 6 years there, so it was when he left school at the age of 17, he discerned a calling to the priesthood. He entered the Jesuits in their novitiate in kind of the centre of Ireland, a place called Rahan in County Offaly. It's within the Diocese of Meath, and he entered there at the age of 18. And a really interesting thing happened in November of that year. The novitiate building went on fire, and he had to be evacuated from the building. And we're told that he had a complete nervous breakdown as a result of being exposed to that fire, and he had to leave the Jesuits for a period of time, certainly a number of weeks. And it was a big question mark as to whether he'd be allowed return as a Jesuit, because at this particular point in time in Ireland, there's absolutely no shortage of priests. In many respects, they've too many, in a sense. So it was really unusual that he was allowed back in, because somebody who had a nervous breakdown because of a fire at that point might have been seen as unfit for the very tough and strenuous work that a Jesuit would have. And I've often pondered, why did he have a nervous breakdown because of that fire? There's no record of any of the other young men who were in the fire having a nervous breakdown. And in fact, it was one of my own children, when I was giving a talk, pointed out, do you not, when I was speculating about this, she said to me, well, do you not think it was the fire that he was caught up in as a child? And I thought, okay, that's exactly what it was, because when he was about 2 or 3 years of age, he was in his cot in the family home. There was a servant knitting beside the cot. He was asleep in the cot, and she fell asleep and knocked a candle over, and the cot went on fire. His father smelled the smoke. He ran in, had to pick the young Willie Doyle out of the cot and put him to safety, and then throw the flaming mattress out the window. And I think there's a strong argument that that experience as a very young child perhaps imprinted somewhere in his psyche a morbid fear of fire. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it seems to be somewhat plausible, at least, that could explain why he had a nervous breakdown at 18. And it really puts his offering of himself to go as a chaplain in his early 40s in perspective, because undoubtedly for any of us this would have been a challenge, but if he had that psychological predisposition to fear of fire, I think it really makes that offering much more heroic. So if you want me to continue, I can talk about his life as a priest, or if you have any questions about his early life there.
I was thinking, right as you were describing the fear of fire, how it is remarkable that he then finds himself in the midst of extreme fire. He ends up dying in a way that is related to fire. And so that early trauma does seem to have influenced in remarkable ways both a fear and a courage in the midst of the fear.
Yes, and I think his story is one of great transformation, really, because we see him, in a sense, living and dying as a hero in World War One. But of course, he was just like any of the rest of us. He felt fear, and he had nervousness, and he had some health complaints that dogged him throughout his entire life. He had some sort of digestive complaint. I'm not quite sure exactly what that was, but undoubtedly it made life in the trenches a little less comfortable. And so we see this tremendous change, strengthening, and transformation. And in many respects, we could say that it's a spiritual transformation that takes place within him. Also brought about because of the way he lived, because he lived a life of great discipline. He was always struggling to overcome his defects, to try and improve himself, to work on his weaknesses. And, he was a Jesuit, so part of the spirituality of the Jesuits and of St. Ignatius of Loyola would be to look at one's dominant defect, one's weakness, and try and act against that. So whatever weakness we have, whatever fault we have, A traditional Jesuit would look and say, okay, how can I overcome that? How can I fight against that? Not in a neurotic way, but recognizing that we're weak, but also recognizing that we have to try and become better people. And so if I have a weakness in an area, I'm really going to struggle to overcome that. And I think perhaps that's what happened with Father Willie's life. Also, I suppose, as a Catholic, believing that it's the grace of God that helped him as well, and that his spiritual practices disposed him to receive that grace and that help from God in that process of transformation.
What drew him into military service as a chaplain? I suppose you mentioned that there are an abundance of priests at this time in Ireland, and so was that part of the motivation, or was there a specific draw to be a military chaplain?
I don't know that it was a specific draw to be a military chaplain, although he was very interested in the military as a child. But that doesn't mark him out as being different from any other boy. I've two boys running around my house who are turning sticks into swords and guns at every moment that they can get. So he was certainly like that and played with soldiers as a young boy. But I think that's typical of boys. Um, there's a couple of things. One is at about the age of 20, he offered himself to God through the hands of Mary, um, to be a Jesuit martyr. He had this desire to die for Christ. And, perhaps in the comfortable world of the 2020s, we might wonder what's all that about. But really, for Christians traditionally, the idea of a martyr is one of great heroism, great self-sacrifice, of shedding one's blood for God. Not that one goes out of one's way to do it, but that one is predisposed to accept it if it comes to it. It wouldn't be a balanced or healthy spirituality if one deliberately went out of one's way to be martyred. But he had this aspiration to give all of himself to God. He also, in that period between when he was ordained as a priest in 1907 and when he died in 1917, so he was a priest for only 10 years, volunteered as a chaplain in 1915 and was accepted volunteered in 1914 and was accepted in 1915, died in 1917. In those 7 years before he volunteered as a chaplain, he spent quite a lot of years as a Jesuit missionary traveling around Ireland and doing a lot of work with different groups of people. And one group of people he worked very closely with were working men. And he wanted to try and help working men live their faith in a more coherent way and in a deeper way. And he perhaps saw the opportunity of going to war as being an opportunity of working with these ordinary working men. He had tried to set up a retreat house for working men. He was, in a sense, ahead of his time because at that point in Irish history, only priests and nuns would have gone on retreats, to go and live in for a few days of prayer. And ordinary workers wouldn't have had that privilege. For Father Willie Doyle, he wanted ordinary workers to be able to do that. So it was perhaps that predisposition also, as I said, to offer himself totally to God, but also a willingness to suffer for God. And again, in the 2020s, it's not something that we read about very much or see very much in contemporary spirituality, but traditionally, saints have wanted to identify themselves with the person of Jesus Christ who died on a cross. They've wanted to make reparation to God for the sins of the world. And they've sought to do that through their own penance and through their own suffering. And so for Father Willie Doyle, the suffering that he would encounter in the war was a way of resembling Jesus Christ. And he also offered up his life in the war in reparation for the sins of priests. In other words, he made himself a sacrifice for the sins of other priests. And that's how he lived as a military chaplain in the war. So I think there are some of the motivations that he had in volunteering.
Was his death in 1917, the summer of 1917, was that impactful to the people of Ireland in a way that seemed like his his early 20 years prior, or when I don't remember when he wrote the letter about talking about being a martyr. Was that 1893? I guess.
So 1893, yes, yes. So in a sense, it was impactful in Ireland a few years later, but it was certainly impactful immediately for the men who knew him. Um, the men he worked with loved him. In a sense, they thought he was never going to die in the war because he had so many scrapes, so many close calls with death. You know, he'd be standing beside some men, a shell would fall and kill the men beside him. He would be unharmed. There were other occasions when he was almost hit with a shell and shrapnel would fall all around him and on top of him, but he'd be unharmed. He was almost killed in a gas attack, very seriously sick on one occasion from breathing in poison gas. So the men were shattered when he was killed, and they wrote poems about him. Certainly, we know they started praying through his intercession very early on. They had this sense that this was a holy man and that he was with God, and you know, he helped them during life, and they felt that he could help them from heaven after his death in that traditional Catholic way of understanding the communion of saints. So again, I don't know what percentage of your viewers are Catholic or not, but just to put it in that kind of theological context. And certainly, you know, men who were at war and came home to Ireland brought the memory of him with them. There's a remarkable story told of in the early 1920s of when his father's house was broken into one evening. His father lived to his mid-90s, which was a great old age even now, but certainly back then was a great age, was living by himself in the house, came down and found a man ransacking his house. The man wasn't too put out by this old man in his 90s looking at him, so he continued going through the drawers looking for valuable things. And he picked up a picture of Father Willie Doyle that he found in a drawer, and he said, "Who was this man to you?" And Hugh Doyle, his father, said, "Well, that was my son." And the thief said, "He was a holy man. He saved many men's lives." And he kissed the picture and he put it in his pocket and he left. So that was the only thing he took. So it was presumably a soldier who Father Willie had known, perhaps even saved his life, and he kept that precious memory of him. And Father Willie Doyle was fairly well known before he went to war as a missionary priest, as a retreat giver, and he also wrote 2 best-selling booklets about the priesthood and vocations and religious life that sold in the tens of thousands during his life. But the real impact after his death came when his friend Alfred O'Rahilly, who was quite well known in his own right, been involved in the Civil War in Ireland, was a professor in a university, ended up becoming president of that university, had a number of children, and then his wife died. He became a priest himself. So he had a very long and interesting career in his own right. But he wrote a book that came out in the early 1920s on Father Willie's life. And that was really a blockbuster and a bestseller. It was translated into the major European languages, went into multiple editions. And it was really this book that was the launching pad for Father Willie Doyle's fame and for the devotion to Father Willie Doyle. So much so that by 1931, so a mere 14 years after Father Willie Doyle's death, the Jesuits in Ireland had received over 50,000 letters testifying to devotion to Father Willie Doyle, and over 6,000 letters alleging that people had prayed to him and had their prayers answered. You know, some of them seemed to be quite significant favours that people were alleging, at least through his intercession. Now, this is before the era of social media and TV and so on. So this is a remarkable organic spread of devotion in about a decade. So really something that was quite global. So it was almost 1,000 of those alleged favours, for instance, from the US. So a very, very global devotion to him.
Have you come across any accounts of people traveling to the place where he died as part of a pilgrimage after the war?
So I suppose that has to be put in the context of the complex history that Ireland has with the First World War. I mean, many Irishmen went to war, they came home and they stayed silent and they wouldn't talk to even their own families about it. And there are 2 explanations for that. One is the trauma that they experienced themselves in war. and how it affected them, and they just didn't want to go back to it. And the second is the complex reality that these Irish men were fighting in the British Army with British soldiers, while Ireland was, in a sense, occupied by the British, or was colonized by the British. And also during a period of time in which Irish men were fighting British soldiers in Ireland as part of the 1916 Rising and War of Independence and so on. So a really fraught period of time in the 1910s and 1920s in terms of the relationship between Ireland and Britain. And so we don't, that I'm aware of, really hear of many people going on pilgrimage then, but we do hear of it now. And certainly I receive, even just yesterday, an email from a lady who's going out there looking to find where Father Willie Doyle died, looking to see what, areas might be associated with his life. So I think there are pilgrimages happening there now. Perhaps they always happened there, but there was, nowhere that people could record that they were going, But certainly there was devotion to him for sure. There were tens of thousands of prayer cards and relics that were produced and distributed, and these fostered the devotion to him. But certainly today there is certainly an interest in a pilgrimage to the areas that he ministered in.
It seems like his faith and his service during the war were significant for those who were around him, who knew him, who may have been, their lives may have been saved by Father Willie Doyle. And so on one level, becoming a martyr makes sense from this religious, spiritual perspective, but it also seems like the subtext here is that he was an Irish martyr, in the sense of dying for those that may have been the the occupiers, the colonizers, and he was sacrificed on behalf of this larger empire's army. And that seems like that would really resonate with the average person in Ireland.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's important to remember so many Irish had died as well. So, and out of all the Irish who died, I mean, Father Willie Doyle is probably not the most famous, but one of the most famous. And in fact, there's no doubt that if you pick up any book about about the Irish in World War One, and you go to the index, Father Willie Doyle is pretty much guaranteed to be there in the index. It's pretty much guaranteed to be in any history of Ireland in World War One. And one of the big reasons for that, of course, is he wrote so many letters home from the war. So many of them were published by Alfred O'Reilly in that biography. And it's a remarkable feature of his life in the war that he's constantly writing home to his father, describing in great detail what the Irish soldiers were going through, doing it all with a tremendous calm and good humour that seems strange or almost supernatural, that somebody could be so joyful and cheerful. Undoubtedly, he suffered, but as an act of charity and love for his father, he was putting a positive spin on all the experiences that he was going through because his father was worried about him. So he is, in a sense, quintessentially the Irish chaplain out there, and dying, representing Jesus Christ, the Good Shepherd, dying to save other men. And that's, in a sense, what he did. And the Gospel says, "No greater love has any man than to lay down his life for his friends." And that's what he did. And an interesting, I suppose, twist on that story of his death, and it, didn't come out in the early biographies of him, is that the two men that he was trying to save when he was killed were Anglicans. They were not Catholic soldiers. One was from Belfast, one was from County Meath. And I think that's really interesting in terms of the history of Ireland, a small island nation divided, bitterly divided on religious lines, when you have this Catholic priest who has died to save members of the other religion. It's a really powerful story, and it's one that, like the mental health dimension, didn't get the attention that it deserved in the early biographies.
I would like to hear all about the Father Willie Doyle Association and your involvement with it. And before we get to that point, I'm really curious, how were you drawn to Father Doyle, his story, his inspiring acts? Did this start for you as when you were a child, or I'd love to hear how that happened for you.
I suppose if you were to say to me, 15 years ago, that I'd be, on this podcast talking about Father Willie Doyle, I would have thought that's, how's that going to happen? It's very, very strange. I really only learned about him about 15 and a half years ago. I live in a town called Dunleary. It's about 2 miles from Dalkey, where Father Willie grew up, and I knew nothing about him. And a friend recommended that I read the original biography, the one by Alfred O'Reilly. I'm not an historian, I'm not a theologian, I'm a professor in a business school, so completely different area of activity. But I have a great interest in reading about history, and I have a great interest in reading about the lives of saints, which I think are, very interesting in their own right for many reasons. I suppose spiritually for me, they're important as a Catholic, but also they're interesting historically. And saints are interesting people from a purely psychological point of view as well, because they're people who distinguish themselves in a very particular area of activity. So I read a lot of books about saints. A friend recommended that I get the book, managed to track down a copy. And when I read the book, I was really blown away because when I was reading the life of Father Willie Doyle, it was like reading the life of the great saints that I would have read about from 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century. He's living like these saints, but he's living very close to my time. And he was from 2 miles away, just up the road from me. This seemed really strange to me, that somebody so close to me in time, okay, it's nearly 100 years ago, but in historical terms, that's very close. And geographic terms, really, really close. So I was really struck by that. One thing led to another, and I set up a website about him that put up a quote every day from his writings, recounting what he did on a particular day in war or during his ministry as a priest. And one thing led to another. I produced a book called To Raise the Fallen, which is a selection of Father Willie Doyle's war letters and prayers. It was published by Ignatius Press in 2018. And then a few of us set up the Father Willie Doyle Association. And in church law or canon law, it's a private association of the faithful, so it's approved by the church. And with the approval and assistance of the Jesuits in Ireland, we are now the actor for the cause. So for a canonization cause, you need a group or body to come forward and ask a bishop to open it in his diocese. And an individual can do it, but it's really unusual for an individual to do it. I don't know if it's ever happened that an individual has done it in the history of the church, but it's very hard for an individual to be the actor, because the actor is responsible for all of the costs associated with a canonization cause, and they can be surprisingly quite large. And then we promote the cause and are responsible for all of those aspects of it. Thanks be to God, the cause was opened in the Diocese of Meath in 2022, so almost 3 years ago. And why Meath? Well, it was in the Diocese of Meath that he entered into the Jesuits. That's where the novitiate was. That's where he had that nervous breakdown. That's where he offered his life as a martyr. And it was also a man from Meath that he was trying to save when he was killed. So there's quite a few Meath connections, even though he wasn't from that area himself. And so the Father Willie Doyle Association, we have a website, williedoyle.org. It's updated pretty much every day. We're on social media. We give talks about him, produce prayer cards, distribute them, and are essentially involved in promoting and facilitating the cause as best we can.
So, what will be involved in the canonization process? I mean, you're certainly doing a lot of work to bring awareness to the life of Father Willie Doyle and his actions and his impact beyond his death in 1917. So, what is the official process? What are the next steps towards
Okay.
this canonization?
Okay, so to go back to the beginning, if somebody's cause is going to be opened, you need a number of things. Number one, you need a kind of record that they lived a holy life. Okay, so you need to be able to have witnesses who say, no, this person lived a life of holiness or self-sacrifice and offering themselves to others. You need a reputation for alleged healings or favors through somebody's intercession. So, there's a long track record there of people saying, well, look, I prayed to Father Willie and I feel that my prayer was answered. And again, I don't know whether I need to go into that with your viewers or whether, they understand the Catholic kind of theology and practice in that regard. Happy to answer any questions on that. I know for Catholic Christians, that can be a little bit of a challenge, but
it would be helpful to
have
a bit of an explanation.
Okay, yes. So I suppose a Catholic doctrine, we would say that there's a communion of saints. Okay, in other words, that when people die, they're still part of the church. There's and God allows them to hear our prayers. So just like I might say to somebody, look, will you please pray for me? I need something. We wouldn't say it's very controversial to ask another person on this earth to pray for us. As Catholics, we would say, well, somebody who's gone before us, we believe may be in heaven, that we would ask them to pray to God for us. It's not that they work a miracle or work a favor, but we're asking somebody to join with us in prayer to seek a particular favor. So that's really the Catholic understanding of that intercessory prayer. It's not that we believe that the saints replace Jesus or replace God, or that Mary replaces Jesus, but that we're part of a family. And on earth, we ask people to pray for us. So in heaven, we do the same. And so there is that reputation for prayers allegedly being answered. Then, as I say, you need an actor or a group that's going to step forward, ask a bishop to run a cause in the diocese. You need a bishop to say yes. The bishop has to be satisfied that there is a reputation for holiness, that there is a reputation for favors, that there's no particular scandal surrounding a person's life. So when a cause is open in a diocese, then evidence is taken normally from people who knew the person. But obviously in this case, there's nobody alive who knew Father Willie Doyle. He died 105 years before his cause was opened. So if it was somebody who died recently, you would take evidence from people who lived with them, worked with them, helped them in different ways, or was helped by them in different ways. In an historic cause, people who are aware of devotion to him and know the history of him give evidence. Then there's a panel of theologians who study his writings to see what's the doctrinal content of them and are they orthodox? Do they align with Catholic teaching? And then when all of that testimony is gathered, if it meets the bishop's approval, then it is sent to Rome. And then a very large document called a positio is written, which is a history of the person's life and an analysis of their spiritual life and the virtues that they lived. And so to be declared a saint, you have to have lived a life of what's called heroic virtue. So it's not just that the person was an ordinarily good person, but that the person was a heroically good person. And I suppose our argument would be that somebody who dies to save other men's lives is a heroically good person. And he lived with that heroism throughout, I would say, all of his life, certainly all of his life that we're aware of, sacrificing himself and risking his life and giving of himself again and again for others. So when that document is written, then that goes to a panel of theologians and they study it. And if they formed a view that he lived heroic virtue, they would propose to the Pope that he would approve of that. And if the Pope agreed, then he would be called Venerable Father Willie Doyle, which means that he lived a life of heroic virtue. And then two more steps are needed. The next step is to be blessed or beatified, and the step after that is to be canonized or a saint. And for each of those steps, you need a miracle through the person's intercession. And that is something that's pretty hard to get. And they are really fascinating if you read the records of miracles that are approved by the Vatican, because the Church uses, in each case, a panel of at least 7 medical experts, doctors, don't all necessarily have to have faith, some of them may have no faith at all, who will review all the medical records of a particular alleged miracle. And if they cannot find any natural explanation for this healing, then they will say, okay, we can't find a natural explanation, and then the church will accept that as a miracle. And as I say, if you look at some of the records that are publicly available, they are extraordinary, healings that defy medical knowledge and that defy, laws of biology. We can talk about some of those if you want. So it's a pretty high bar. It's not a case of a person was sick, a person got treatment, a person got better, and the church says it's a miracle. No, any treatment is looked at very carefully. And very often people who get treatment now, their cases can't be used because treatments are so advanced. So they're simply not used for canonization causes. It has to be something that's very clearly beyond medical explanation.
Are there recent examples of healing in the case of people praying for Father Willie Doyle's intercession?
So there are. I mean, we get reports. I mean, out of respect for people, we have to keep them private unless they're willing to talk about them. But I can say that within the last few years, there are a handful of cases of healings that potentially look like they're beyond medical explanation. It's not to say that they are. They potentially could be. And in at least one of those cases, there's a panel of doctors looking at them. Can't say any more about it other than that. It may not stand up to scrutiny in the end. You go back to the drawing board then, but the bar is very, very high for establishing that whatever happened here, we can't explain it medically.
The miracles in terms of healing focused on physiological healing, and or are there cases where psychological or mental health issues have been addressed? Is that also considered an act of healing?
So it could be considered an act of healing, but it won't be accepted by the church as a miracle because it lacks physiological proof.
Okay.
So we do have people who will say, look, I suffered from anxiety or depression or addiction. I prayed to Father Willie Doyle. I've overcome this. I feel peace and healing that I've never felt before. And that's wonderful. But the church won't accept any healing of that nature because there isn't a physiological, normally you're looking at something where there's scans and there's tests, there's x-rays or MRIs, and there's a disease. And then subsequently there's no disease and there's no way of explaining how the disease disappeared. So unfortunately, we don't have that with psychological issues, but that's not to say that they're not real transformations in people's lives.
And perhaps not to say that this type of verification would not be possible in the future, particularly with brain mapping and brain scans. There can be physiological evidence of change within the brain, the neuropathways. So perhaps in the future that may be possible.
Potentially, and maybe with that sort of technology, maybe there's something possible now. I'm not aware of it, but I suppose then you've got to look at to what extent people say the brain has a certain degree of plasticity.
That's right.
To
And
begin with.
before and after,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it would be difficult to
yeah.
have the records to compare a pre and post type of miraculous intervention.
I mean, the types of miracles that are approved. I mean, I'm by no means an expert on it, but some of the ones that I'm aware of, just people who have metastatic cancer on a Friday, pray to somebody, go back to hospital on a Monday, and the metastatic cancer is gone. Okay, I mean, it's pretty hard to explain that through any known physical process. There's a case of, I don't know if you're familiar with the person of St. Frances Cabrini, who, there's a movie about her a couple of years ago. She was an Italian nun, went to the US, did a lot of work with Italian immigrants in the US. And the miracle that was used for her was a remarkable story of a newborn baby in a hospital, had something wrong with his eye, and the nurse was told to put a certain amount of, can't remember what the type of acid was, 0.01% acid or something in the child's eye to clean it out. And she completely got the measure wrong, and she put a much, much higher dose of acid, which burned the baby's eye. and not only burned the baby's eye, but burned a track of acid down the baby's face and out of both eyes. It burnt the track down. The doctor saw the eyes and said, this child is never going to see again. The cornea is burnt, the eye is burnt, the eyes are gone. And the nuns at the hospital were obviously so distraught. They prayed and prayed and prayed to Francis Cabrini. Overnight, put a relic of Francis Cabrini on the baby's eyes. And when they took the bandages off the next day, the eyes were perfect. The child was able to see. And, but the child kept the burn marks as proof. This wasn't something that people imagined. The scars were there for the acid coming down the face, but the eyes were made whole. Again, many witnesses saw that, many witnesses testified to it, and very hard to explain that through any physiological process. So it's a pretty high bar that one is dealing with here.
Yeah, those stories are incredible. And I think they elevate everyone's faith when they're shared and known about. Why do you think Father Willie Doyle's story is resonating with so many people right now?
I would say perhaps his time has come. In my view, I would say in God's providence, his time has come because he has something to say to us and to say to the world today. If I look at aspects of his story that weren't recognized 100 years ago when he was killed, the mental health aspect was very much downplayed. Whereas today we would say, well, so many people have struggles in the mental health domain. And here's this man who seems to have overcome it, that he's inspiring for people. It's not just somebody who managed to go on with his life in a happy way, but managed to go out and confront danger and overcoming this trauma that he had with fire. I think for many people, especially Catholics, given what we've seen happen in the history of the church over the last couple of decades, the fact that here was a priest who explicitly offered up his life as a sacrifice to God in reparation for the sins of priests. And that means something more today than it did 100 years ago. And important to note that, we know kind of awareness of these things. I mean, he was talking about priests who were lazy and lying in bed and not getting up and saying mass and saying their prayers. That's what he had in mind with the sins of priests. But it has a resonance today. But I think it's possibly down to his humanity. Okay. I mean, this was a very human man. And if I may say, I mean, using the word saint in inverted commas, a very human saint, because he had weaknesses. Sometimes when people read the hagiographies of Catholic saints, it seems like they kind of floated down from heaven and were perfect from an early age. But that's not the case with Father Willie Doyle. I mean, here's a man who had weaknesses like we all had. He was a very strong-willed man. He had tremendous fortitude and self-discipline. But the opposite side of the coin for somebody who has fortitude and self-discipline is often that they can be impatient and short-tempered. So Father Willie Doyle could be impatient and short-tempered. And we see that he struggled and strove to overcome that particular defect. When we read in his diaries, aspects of which weren't published, but reading in his private diaries, it's very edifying to see how he really struggled. He would say, look, I gossiped about somebody today and I shouldn't have done that. Or many of us can identify with that. Or, I gave out about somebody behind their back. Or I was tired after lunch and I lay down and I slept until dinner time. And okay, it's not that that's necessarily a big defect, but, as a priest, he probably shouldn't have been doing that. And he struggled to overcome those defects. And he was successful. You could see this transformation of his life over time, where he's becoming more and more and more heroic. Like all of us, we have to try and become better and better and better. And it's not something that you achieve in a day, but it's something that you spend your life working on. And you could see that slow and steady progress in his life, not through self-will alone necessarily, but also with the grace of God and disposing himself to God's help to be a better person. But I think also his sense of humor, because he's a very funny man. He's constantly telling jokes, telling stories, playing practical jokes, even in the trenches, playing practical jokes on others. And so he's just a very human, very attractive person. His writing is very gripping, and there's a wonderful warmth in what he says.
Elements of his story, for me, that really is compelling and I feel drawn to, is the fact that when he died, his remains were never found. And there is this idea in my mind that he sort of can be everywhere and nowhere at the same time, because does he have a gravesite in Ireland? Was there a family at the church? Is Yeah,
There is a picture of him in the local church that he would have been gone to as a child, where he was baptized, where he would have served mass, where he played the organ because he was quite musical as well. He is mentioned on the Tyne Cot Memorial, but his body, as you say, has never been well. Let me just go back and say his body was discovered on the day of death. The story is that some soldiers removed some buttons from his uniform and the pioneer pin he was wearing. So he was a pioneer. So many people at that time in Ireland, many Catholics were pioneers, which means that you make an offering never to drink alcohol. You wear a little pin of the Sacred Heart and you make that offering in reparation for the sins of alcoholics. So that pin and some buttons were removed, and they're preserved. And then he went back to get his body. They made a note of where it was, and his body was gone. So we assume probably one of three things happened. Either in the confusion of war, they forgot exactly where it was and made a mistake about where they thought his body was. Secondly, somebody else could have found the body and buried it. Or thirdly, perhaps another shell fell and completely obliterated the body. In some respects, it's kind of fitting that we don't know where his body is, because, he lamented the men dying. He referred to them as, my poor brave boys, he called them. There they lay out in the field while their chaplain, loves them like a parent. He had this great love for these soldiers. So in some respects, it's fitting that he's buried in the ground with a lot of them, and it's unknown where he is. At another level, it would be wonderful to find his body, and it's still not impossible that his body could be found, because bodies are still found to this day, and sometimes they're even identified. I don't know what would happen with his body if it's found unidentified. I mean, it'd be wonderful to be able to bring it back and have a shrine to him. But that's really speculation. I mean, I don't expect it could be found, even though it's theoretically possible. I have been able to track back that some point in the 1990s there was a lady claiming to have psychic powers who claimed to know where it was. I don't know anything about that, but anyway, his body was never found. But there are, monuments to him. We do have items that he owned. We do have his crucifix, we have his rosary beads, buttons from his uniform, items of his clothing. There's preserved some of his hair from his first haircut. There's a little bit of his blood, because that offering of his life as a martyr, he signed that in his blood. So in a sense, if he is declared to be a saint, these things will be preserved in shrines, and they will also be places of pilgrimage. So even though we don't have a full body, we have items that he owned, and then some elements of his body, hair and blood, very small fragments though.
What's it like to be a part of this movement? It's quite historically significant, I think. Maybe in 20 years, you'll look back and see just how significant. What has that been like for you as a Catholic, but as a person who has come to see Father Willie Doyle as such a meaningful person through his life, but as also as a chaplain?
Yes, I mean it's moving, and it's very humbling. Okay, because I get to play a role in this particular phenomenon, um, and it's also a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to tell his story and to be able to give talks about him, and to run a website, produce books about him, and to work with other people. I mean, there's many people involved in the process. So it's all of those things. It's humbling. It's also a privilege. Um, it can be, I suppose, a little. It's not very emotional now, but occasionally it is. And I think if he ever becomes a saint, if he's ever canonized, I hope he is. I believe perhaps he will be, but it's up to the church to make that declaration. And if I live long enough, because it's not a short process, I think that would be a very emotional event for me and for many, many other people, including his family members. There are members of his family who are alive, and we're in touch with them as well. But it's also humbling, because I see what a remarkable person he was. And I, in many ways, I'm very much the opposite of him in terms of his natural temperament. His natural strengths are not mine, and probably my natural strengths may well not have been his. So I'm very opposite to him in many respects. But because of that, I admire him because he has strengths that I don't have. And, in that sense, I'd like to be more like him if I could be.
You mentioned the buttons, pieces of his hair, blood, the pin that may become affiliated with shrines in the future. Is that something that is on the minds of you and your colleagues at the association and his family? Are you thinking about what these shrines will look like and where they'll be located?
Partly, I mean, it's in a sense that's kind of jumping the gun quite a bit, and it's quite a bit further down the road. But I do know, and our postulator. So every cause, when we talked about the cause, we didn't talk about the postulator. Every cause appoints a postulator, who is the person who represents the cause within the church with the authorities in Rome. So our diocesan postulator, Father John Hogan, who's a priest from the Diocese of Meath, he has a great visions for potentially a shrine to Father Willie, where a lot of the items would be preserved and people could come and visit them. Um, to a certain extent, that would be, even if he was canonized, that would be dependent upon having the funds in order to establish such a place. So if you have any viewers who want to help fund a shrine to Father Willie, we'd be delighted to hear. But I suppose also in Catholic tradition, there is the tradition of distributing relics to people. And currently we distribute what are called third class relics, which are pieces of cloth that have been touched to Father Willie's hair and to Father Willie's crucifix. And eventually, if his cause proceeds and he is beatified, we would distribute small fragments of his clothing, which would go into churches around the world, and a church could apply to have one of those relics and have a little shrine to Father Willie. And we get requests from all over the world for relics. We distribute third class relics, as I say. So certainly a lot of interest in the US, but from all around the world as well. Surprisingly, Asia, Africa, South America, all over Europe as well.
Do you think there's something about his story that is resonating with people from a perspective that war is on Europe's doorstep at the moment? Is that element of his story something that seems more poignant, or is that not really the case from what you have been encountering, hearing, reading?
When you ask me why his story may be coming out now, and it's one thing I didn't say. I mean, it could be um, that he's relevant for today because war is on the doorstep of Europe, and maybe look, a lot of people I think in Europe live in a certain amount of denial about that. I would say it's something certainly I don't want to see, and I certainly want to see peace. Um, but I also recognise that the period of peace that Europe has lived through over the last number of decades is unusual in the wider span of history. And so it could be that I would say, in a Catholic sense, in the designs of God's providence, that his example could be relevant for those reasons. I hope that's not the case. I hope that we have peace. But I certainly know men and women in the military, and I know military chaplains as well, who have a devotion to him because perhaps they fear that this is a path that we may end up going down.
I have read on your website that you have some upcoming events in the United States during which you'll be talking about uh, the canonization process and bringing awareness to the person of Father Willie Doyle. Where are those events, and how might people find you if they're listening or watching this and they would like to see you in person or see your group in person?
Yep. So we are going to the US we give a lot of talks around Ireland and to some extent in other places in Europe, but primarily in Ireland. But we're doing our first ever US trip. It's starting on Saturday, October the 25th. So if you're watching before October the 25th, you're lucky. If you're watching after that, you've missed it. But if people want to go to williedoyle.org and look around there, you'll see notification of the events. But in summary, we're at St. Christina's Church in south side of Chicago on Saturday, October 25th. Sunday, October 26th, we're at St. John Canty's Church, which is in the center of Chicago. On Monday, October 27th, we're at the National Shrine of St. Maximilian Kolbe in Marytown in Libertyville, Illinois. On Tuesday, October 28th, we're in Chicago Gaelic Park. And then on Thursday, October the 30th, we're in South Bend, Indiana. So if anybody is watching before those events happen and want to come along, you're very welcome. And we will have Father Willie Doyle's crucifix with us that people can see and get a blessing with our crucifix if they want. But, we're also happy to travel if other people want to organize events, or if they have conferences or want to help us organize a speaking tour. We'd be delighted to take part in that and to spread Father Willie's story because it's something that all of us involved love doing.
Will you be at the University of Notre Dame
So
at the
we,
last event?
Yeah, we won't be in Notre Dame itself, but we're in the Cathedral of St. Matthew in South Bend, so it's very close to Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm. What was the impetus for beginning this tour in Chicago?
So I suppose, we wanted to go to the US because there's a lot of devotion to Father Willie in the US, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, number one, it's a heroic story, and I think a lot of Americans are attracted to that heroism, to that military heroism in particular. And then, there's a strong, obviously, Irish and Catholic dimension to the story. And for certain cities, I suppose, all over Ireland, all over the US, you get Irish Catholics, but there's certain cities that have a lot of Irish Catholics. Chicago happens to be one of them. And we have a good friend, a priest in Chicago, who was very devoted to Father Doyle. And so we've worked with him in setting up this inaugural tour. In many ways, I suppose it's a bit experimental to see how it goes. But we would hope to be back maybe in 2026 or other years to speak in other cities. We're looking particularly to go to Boston and New York. So if any viewers are in Boston and New York want to get in touch with us, contact us through the website williedoyle.org or info@williedoyle.org. You can get us that way as well.
I hope there is a large turnout to these events so that people can learn more about the life and death of Father Doyle, as well as the work that you're doing and others are doing in the canonization process. It feels to me somewhat uh, exciting. It feels like that I get to peer in on the precipice of what may be a new pilgrimage site or series of sites. And very rarely is that the case for a person who studies pilgrimage. We typically are looking at sites that have long established pilgrimage traditions, and so we're looking at how practices have evolved over time. And this seems like maybe I get to see the beginning of something before it even starts by looking at the person himself, and then that I look forward to tracking this for probably many decades, because I think that certainly Father Willie Doyle is inspiring. I've been inspired by his life and the writings that have been published about him, and in talking to you, and so it seems interesting and exciting to be able to think about the possibility of visiting uh, a shrine or a number of shrines at some point. Certainly, the next time that I visit Tynecott, I will look for his name. So I will make a pilgrimage myself to see his name on this particular monument. And so, thank you for taking the time to share all of this with me today.
You're very welcome, and it's great that you're interested in this dimension of pilgrimage, because, to be honest, it is something within the association that we have talked about. Should we look to bring a group on pilgrimage to these sites? It's not something that we have done yet. I myself have only been there once, actually. So maybe you'd like to come along whenever we, if we do bring a group.
Love to come along.
Yeah. So, something we can, explore into the future. And there are side pilgrimages that one could make in that sense, because there were quite a number of saints to whom Father Willie Doyle had a devotion, and some of them are nearby, that, could be incorporated into a wider Willie Doyle pilgrimage, not just walking in his physical footsteps, but walking in his spiritual footsteps by visiting other shrines that he would have visited at other points before he became a chaplain.
Yeah, that's a great point. This is multi-layered, actually, to be able to walk in the footsteps of Father Willie Doyle from his early life through his time as a young priest, and then into northern France, where he eventually died in 1917. And also, I think I've read on your site and through other publications about the number of pieces of interest in the interwar era that also tie to his life. And so that's interesting, even from a literary pilgrimage standpoint, to delve into his writings in that way.
Yeah. There's a lot there in Father Willie's story, and a lot to be unpacked in the future years. Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick, for taking the time to speak with me about your interest in the life of Father Willie Doyle and the association, and for explaining a number of Catholic terms and processes. Um, I think that's helpful for myself and for other listeners and viewers as well. And I hope people attend the events. Go out and attend any of these events if you're in the Chicago or South Bend area. I think they're going to be very meaningful.
I hope so, and I hope it brings a lot of new knowledge, consolation, and fruit to people's lives.